Hello students, welcome back to another discussion on the Analyst for 22nd of September 2023. In this session, we will be trying to understand some of the important articles from today's Indian Express and the Hindu. So, looking at the very table of contents, we can find that the first article is about India's success in our space missions. This is with regards to recent debates which are going on the Lok Sabha. Next, we will be looking at some of the countries that India and those countries are in bittersweet relations, such as the recent countries are Canada, Turkey, right? Then we will be looking at the delimitation exercise in India. Then we shall be trying to understand the climate action summit that is going to take place very soon. And finally, we will be concluding the discussion with household savings in India. Now, before starting the discussion, I want to announce that the description of this discussion is containing the handout of this discussion. So do definitely check it out. Now, in this very first article, we are hearing that ISRO is planning to wake up our Vikram and Pragyan rovers. Because of the extreme lunar conditions, the space equipments were generally switched off for a temporary period of time. Now, accordingly, we are also having some debates in the Lok Sabha about India's success with reference to their science program and space program. Now here, we need to understand and appreciate the history of India's space program so far. Now here, let me start with the very beginning when India became independent. When she became independent, let me tell you, India was a country full of illiteracy and poverty, and even the world media at that time was very speculative, and they were very also apprehensive of the fact that if India could ever become a developed country. Now, at that point of time, the very first Prime Minister of the country, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, he had a vision in mind, particularly with reference to their economic and the scientific development of the country. Now, with reference to economic planning, we have studied about how India went on to implement the planning stage. Also, with respect to the science and research development, Pandit Nehru was very curious on launching the space missions, because back in 1950s and 1960s, when the nations of US and Russia were locked in a space race between them, India could not sit on the bylines. She also needed to aspire to have her own indigenous space program. That is why, India had some objectives in mind, because we have to understand back then there were two schools of thoughts with reference to India's space program. One school of thought were very negative and pessimistic, that India, being a poor country, being an underdeveloped country, could not have her own space program. On the other side, another school of thought was that if India tried enough, if India started right now, she could definitely do it. Now here, we have to understand why India needed space program at all, because there were some objectives. Now the objectives, you have to understand that the very primary objectives were twofold. First, it is about the discovery and research of the space activities. For example, studying the various stars, planets, and the galaxies beyond. So that is giving impetus to human curiosity. Then it is also about resource management and disaster management in our own nation, because satellites which are launched into space, they have specialized equipments, radars, cameras, and various other sensitive instruments. These will be mapping India's surfaces, coastlines, waters, and they will be giving us feedback. And also this feedback can be monitored and factored into our disaster management control measures, because we can now use satellites for scanning the clouds and the circulation, precipitation, and hence we can, for an example, predict an impending flood, an impending cyclone on our coasts. So, space program is not only about studying and research and those activities, it's also about the practical real life applications in this manner. Now also, we have to understand, when we get data from the space, we also understand that it can be also useful for our environmental concerns, because we can get some useful inputs with reference to carbon emissions, with reference to polluting industries located along, say, rivers, right? So we can also get these sensitive maps. And with reference to, reconnaissance satellites, with reference to internal security satellites which are specially deployed by our armed services and also the government of India. We can also control any internal security threats and also limit terrorism to a respect. Also, finally, we have to understand the weather forecasting is also highly dependent on our space activities. So, keeping these objectives in mind, back in 1950s, 1960s, India started to kind of develop its own Indian space program. Now, these can be divided into some 5-6 phases. The very first phase took off in 1960s to 1970, where in 1961, our Prime Minister back then set up the Department of Atomic Energy under Homi J. Bhabha, who is the father of India's nuclear program. Thereafter, Homi J. Bhabha created Indian National Committee for Space Research, which is told to be the very first institution propelled towards space research in India. Then Dr. Vikram Sarabhai was called upon to become the chairperson of this INCOSPAR. And thereafter, by Dr. Sarabhai's efforts to promote India's space activities, we had a tremendous exponential growth in this field. Starting from the very first efforts of India, we have to understand that in 1962, India selected a site in Kerala near Thiruvananthapuram, which was near Thumba. Now, this space station was the very first space station of India. But let me tell you, this space station was located on the magnetic equatorial zone, right? Now, this Thumba Equatorial Rocket Launching Station, which is known as TERS, launched India's first ever rocket. And these are the kind of rockets known as sounding rockets, which belong to the Rohini family. This was a name given to them. Actually, the rockets were of American origin by the name of Apache. So, we have to understand that these are the sounding rockets which enabled India to study space weather, or say it also enabled India to study about our weather measurement near this particular region of magnetic equator. Now, in 1969, thereafter, the ISRO was set up for the first time. Subsequently, in 1972, the Department of Space was also set up. So, this was the very initial stage of India's space program. Thereafter, the phase 2 witnessed from 1970 to 1980. Here, there was a study by NASA who was, very curious to look at how you can use satellites back then for fulfilling various needs of humanity. For example, back then, even a televised event, for example, the Olympics were going on, right, in the, decades preceding. The very first televised Olympics was held during this time. And this was a very big revolution because these employed the use of satellites. So NASA actually went on to explore how satellites can be used into various diverse uses. And let me tell you, our own Dr. Sarabhai was keenly following this study. And that is why he also launched some research in India also. Thereafter, in 1975, India launched its first satellite, which is known by the name of Aryabhatta. But this was not launched by us, this was launched by USSR back then, because we did not have such sensitive equipments, because we were short on funds, right? So when India started, we have to understand Soviet Union, the US were already on the moon, right? So they were quite advanced. So we were utilizing their technologies because we had lack of funds. Then in 1979, the Sriharikota rocket launching station was finally introduced. And this saw the very first launch in 1979, which was a failure due to a control malfunction, right? Now, this problem was kind of solved by 1980s, and the 1980s will be seeing the very first phase of India developing its own satellite launch vehicle, because by now India was kind of reliant on other nations. So India tried to diversify its portfolio into its own domestic manufacturing of SLVs. Now India thought of SLVs in terms of polar orbit, right? And let me tell you, these polar orbits are very difficult, especially for India, because we have Sri Lanka, and we need a particularly location which is totally devoid of any human habitation. So generally India had to do a very difficult maneuver if it wanted to go on a polar orbit. So it was kind of very specialized technology, and that's why India took its time. So in 1980s it conceptualized the polar orbit SLV. It just conceptualized. In 87 they actually tried to experiment it via the augmented satellite launch vehicle, but it was a failure because due to malfunction of various sensitive instruments, this could not be a success. And also they tried to attempt in 1988 also, it also failed. So it was kind of a setback for India. But India was ever very much confident of their own success in the coming years. So in 1990 to 2000, India developed its first ever satellite launch of the ASLV, which was a failure yesterday. Then from 1994, no one can stop India till now also, because India successfully develops its own polar satellite launch vehicle, which was very difficult to implement, and this would become even till now the most reliable space satellite launch vehicle for India. Right now we have to understand, post 2000 the Indian satellite program, or say the Indian space program, took a very successful liftoff. In 2001 it was the very first development flight of the GSLV, right? And in 2008 the Chandrayaan-1 mission was launched, which still is giving important data with respect to formation of water on the surface of the moon. So it was launched in 2008. Then in 2010 plus we had various missions which was kindly launched by these our own indigenous satellite launch vehicles, such as PSLV, GSLV and GSLV Mark III. Now GSLV Mark III has been renamed to Launch Vehicle Mark III. So we have to understand that these are the same things, but now it has been rechristened. Now in 2010 onwards we can see the ISRO's satellites, ISRO's launches reaching their highest success forever. Now we have to understand that during this period of time we launched the Mangalyaan mission, we launched various Earth observation programs such as ResourceSat, Cartosat, OceanSat. Then we have various Earth observation satellites which will be observing our Earth, which will be observing the various crucial aspects, minerals, resources, clouds, right, our own terrain, surface, which will be giving us very high precision images of every corner of our country especially. Then we also launched something known as Indian Regional Navigation Satellite System, or known as IRNSS. This is now rechristened as NAVIC. NAVIC or IRNSS is similar, and it is telling that India, or it is trying to be India's own GPS or global positioning system, apart from fulfilling some other specialized needs also. Then India very recently was successful in the Chandrayaan-3 lunar surface landing, which was applauded by the world over. So it was an astounding success. And apart from that, India also launched the XPOSat, which is looking at the X-ray cosmic radiations from the space, and it will be studying about the background of the universe, about the history and research about the origin of the universe. Finally, as of now, India also launched the Aditya L1 mission, which is garnered to study the sun and the various solar events, the sun's coronosphere and various other events which have also been covered in the previous analysis, so do definitely check it out. Now here, we have to understand and appreciate that the road ahead for India's space program is a very prosperous one, and that is why we all are discussing even after now, right? Even after, a couple of weeks after India's successful launch of the Chandrayaan-3 and also of the Aditya L1, that Indian Space Research Organization, the ISRO, is going leaps and bounds. And that is why recently Indian Space Policy 2023 was also released by the government of India, where it is trying to promote more and more space activities in the months and years to come. It is also trying to partner with the private sector in India, where the private sector, such as the startups, they can bring in their own expertise, innovation, capital, and also the foreign companies can also come in India, trying to garner the Indian space sector. Then we have to understand and appreciate the role of space in our technological advancement and the expansion of our industrial base. We have to understand that space has various applications that we have seen in the very beginning. So we need to appreciate this. And finally, the future missions such as the Gaganyaan mission, the Shukrayaan mission, and the own Indian space station, which is supposed to launch in the subsequent coming years. These will be trying to uplift India's space program and add more feathers in our crown. So we need to closely monitor and closely try to make these missions more and more successful and ensure that the funds never stop going to ISRO. Finally, India must try to capitalize, right? India must try to capitalize this kind of success that we are having right now, because there is a huge market for exports in the space sector. For example, India launches the satellites of some friendly nations, right? Even Russia uses our own satellite launch stations to launch their own satellites. So we can use and leverage our strength in our space programs, in our confidence to rise to increase our exports in the subsequent years, especially by promoting space exports in our neighboring countries such as Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and also the near neighborhoods such as the Southeast Asian nations. So we must be trying to leverage this expertise that we have garnered over the period of time. Now we have to go to the next article, which is talking about the strained relations between India and Canada. This is a very important section of our GS2, where we have effect of policies and politics of developed and developing countries on Indian interests and on India's diaspora. Now see, as of now we are seeing that the Indian-Canadian relations are deteriorating on a very fast basis. Now this is coming on the heels of the Canadian Prime Minister's statements in their own parliament that the Indian government is kind of linked towards the killing of a Canadian citizen, which India, and rightly so, claims to be a Khalistani operative. So nevertheless, the repercussions in that matter, which was kind of also discussed in the previous sessions. In this session today, we will be discussing on how India has some strained relations, or say some sour and bittersweet relations with some nations, particularly with Canada and also with other nations. Now, initially we have to first appreciate the India-Canadian perspective. See, from the mid 20th century, or say I can say from 1950s onwards, just after Indian independence, the Indians particularly in their 40s and 50s, they tried to migrate to the western nations of say Canada, United Kingdom, US, and even some went to the Middle East. Now, the diaspora that we have in those regions right now, the heavy diaspora that we have in those nations can be highly said to be from this duration, right? And this was due to the various liberal policies, the various economic policies of those nations, such as the Canadian, US. They tried to make their borders more open because they wanted more and more immigrants who were specifically skilled laborers. Even in 1962, the Canadian immigration policy was eased and it was made more lucrative for Indians, especially the Sikh population, which migrated a huge number in 1960s to Canada, because Canada in their immigration policy, they became more and more open and more anti-discriminative. So it was natural, and also they also encouraged the technically skilled Indians. Then we have to understand that India and Canada during the Cold War, they shared a bonhomie because they shared some values that the world should not be divided into two poles of say competing nature, say the US and the USSR. So they shared some of the important ideals internationally. But in 1990s, we have to understand that when the LPG reforms happened in India and the entire world was in the garb of multilateralism, which means that after the Cold War in 1990s, the US tried to garner or gather the whole world under the aegis of the United Nations, under the aegis of some multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, IMF, and even in our own nation, the LPG reforms of 1990 tried to emphasize that we have to undertake some reforms of globalization. We have to undertake some democratic reforms so that we can be part of the global multilateral scheme of events. And even this was not a very bad idea on any country's part, that multilateralism is the way to go forward. And eventually India and Canada, they both supported this kind of change that was brought in the wake of 1990s globalization and post-Cold War era. Subsequently, it will be seen that USA will be becoming more and more dominant because these multilateral organizations were kind of funded, were kind of controlled directly and indirectly by the US. But that is not the scope of discussion for today. We'll be concentrating on India and Canada so far. So in 1998, we know that India, tested its own nuclear arsenal at the Pokhran tests, and Canada rebuked India for conducting such nuclear tests, right? And not only Canada, almost the entire West, they came together to criticize India for doing the nuclear test, right? And Canada was also one of them. And from there we can understand that there have been many instances of when the domestic Canadian politics kind of tried to influence Indian relations with Canada. Because we have to understand the Khalistan movement, which was going on both Indian and abroad soils, these also reached Canadian shores. And the Sikh population there have a kind of considerable hold on the present government of Canada of the day. Now, even the Prime Minister of Canada has support of the Sikh population in their cabinet. That is why it is said that the Canadian Prime Minister is playing the second fiddle to those aspirations of separatist movement in India. Now, apart from that, we have to understand the Indian-Canadian relationship is also based on investment and trade. If we look at some of the factors, we can see the trade baskets of imports and exports to and from Canada and India. And according to DPIIT, Canada accounts for only 0.56% of the total FDI in India. Then Canada is also home to around 5.6% of total overseas Indians, which is a considerable amount. Also, every seventh Indian student who is studying abroad is also studying in Canada. It is also the fourth largest source of Indian tourists in India. The bilateral trades, but is very low, as of around 0.7% only. And the most important imports from Canada into India are coking coal, potassium chloride, lentils, masoor dal. Now this may be a surprising fact for all, but let me tell you, much of India's chunk of lentils or masoor dal is actually imported from Canada. And also we import newsprint and wood pulp. So these are the top 5 imports. And why we are discussing this? Because maybe these all parameters or these all facts or facets between these particular nations may be affected in the recent times. Now we have to understand that beyond Canada, India need to look at some of the other bittersweet countries that these countries hold opinion against India. The very first country, is directly neighborhood, and it is not only causing us trouble, but it is causing trouble in the entire world. It is China. India and China has a long history of conflicts with reference to military and territorial disputes, especially along the northern border of India, spanning the east, west and middle sector of our Indian border with China. Then also China meddles in various internal security matters with reference to when Masood Azhar was actually supposed to be convicted as a terrorist or declared as a terrorist by the United Nations Security Council. China used his veto to block that move, specifically to say appease or please or whatever you say Pakistan. Then trade relations with India has also been very much tumultuous with respect to China. China has a very favorable trade balance on their side because China believes in dumping and this dumping is a very sophisticated economic activity that is practiced by some of these nations who try to dump their products at a very low price in India. So the trade relations and tensions are also there, where the trade, even the digital services applications with reference to mobile applications, they are also having some issues. Indian government are also having some issues. Also, during COVID crisis in 2020 to 2021, which prompted actually India to change its FDI policy, are the hostile turnovers that some of the companies, Indian companies, were becoming non-profitable during the COVID crisis. They were being taken over by Chinese, right? So these are the instances. Even China went on to purchase around 1% stake in our HDFC Bank. So these hostile turnovers are also employed by China. Then Pakistan, I did not elaborate too much, because they have been rivals for a long time since their independence, and also they are expected to be so in the near future. Bangladesh also has some unresolved issues with India with reference to their land disputes, which were kind of settled in the 2010 decade. And also there are some border disputes, then water sharing disputes are there, right? Then there is also illegal migration, allegations of illegal migration which are coming from Bangladesh, cattle smuggling allegation which is taking place along the borders of Assam and West Bengal. Nepal has some trade issues with India. There have been various instances where Nepal has alleged that India is, using nefarious tactics with reference to some goods. Then we have to understand that some of the border disputes, especially the Kala Pani dispute, which took place in 2019-20 with India and Nepal. They are also strained some of the relations. Then if I talk of Iran, US and Iran are locked in, bitter diplomatic battles and also bad relations with each other since 2018-19. And that is why India is also kind of indirectly forced not to import Iran oils. Nevertheless, they have kind of resolved their issues, India and Iran, on a bilateral level, specifically with the easing of the, leasing and easing of the Chabahar port. Now, so another country comes to the picture, that is Turkey, with which India has a very, seesaw relation. Because when India abrogated the Article 370, Turkey kind of did hue and cry because of Pakistan's involvement and its proximity also to China, due to which also in the recent G20 meet, when the India-Middle East corridor was announced, Turkey told that it may not be able to implement this on its own borders, right? Then we have Malaysia also, who have been also critical of India on India's Kashmir's policies, and also with reference to various palm oil restrictions done by India. Finally, Afghanistan in early 2021 were also having some bittersweet relations with India, especially after the takeover of Taliban. So Taliban and India share a long history of not a very good relation, specifically with their alliance or say indirect alliance with Pakistan and terrorism activities. And also with reference to the drug menace or say the drug cartel that runs along Afghanistan to Central Asia. So these are some of the countries. Now we have to understand what are the implications for India's strategic ambitions in backdrop of such relations with these countries. Now we have to understand these relations or say difficult relations, right, will be making it more difficult for India to build and maintain healthy partnerships. Now we have to understand partnerships are based on trust, and if the countries are not trusting each other, how can partnerships build? And this will be limiting India's ability to extend its influence and power. Right? It will be also not be able to achieve its foreign policy goals and ambitions. Then what about the economic interests that the Indian investors have in some of the nations? Specifically in these nations, there will be very much high amount of economic competition, mostly in unfair ways. Also, there will be some security crisis, and this will be hurting India in this aspect. Then It will be making it more difficult to project India's power and prestige, specifically if India wants to be a Vishwa Guru in the near future. And if India wants to become one of the poles in the multipolar world, India cannot afford to have so much, difficulties in international relations. So this is a point to think about, right? Then it will be also risking the increase of risk and instability in the region, specifically with China and Pakistan. But we have to understand that India does not have such relations, even with the countries listed below in such a negative tone. Specifically, the countries such as China and Pakistan, specifically, which India will forever be kind of having some conflicts. The rest of the nations, they kind of have some shifting games with themselves, right? Now, these threads, this fabric must be sewn in such a manner. It must be reflecting the leadership of the day, the demands of the day. And that is why there are some thoughts. There are some thoughts in this favor that in the Canadian case, we have to understand that the real culprit actually, we have to understand is electoral politics in Canada. The Indian diaspora, particularly the Sikh diaspora in India, who are propelled for their own political aspirations, they are kind of coercing their own prime minister into fueling separatist movements because they can garner votes by doing these extreme activities in their own soil of Canada. So, we have to understand this. Then, under this present government of Canada, there is very little hope of reconciliation because the government is kind of supported by the coalition or say cabinet of Khalistani separatists ministers. So that is that. Even some of the important ministers in Trudeau's cabinet indirectly vouched or supported the Khalistani movement. So reconciliation hopes are very low. But the two countries can kind of cooperate on their serious and open diplomatic dialogues. And also we have to understand that nevertheless, we are having this kind of issues. We have seen that with reference to bilateral trade, with reference to many other parameters, Canada is not that much of significant to India. We have to understand Canada's population is just 40 million, right? Nothing compared to India's diaspora even internationally. Now, India's strength lies in India's image because without India, Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy and its hope to counter China can never be a possibility. Then other nations such as Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, the games kind of keep shifting with reference to domestic politics. So we have to keep aware of that, and also the government of the day in India, they are highly aware of these facts. So they will be kind of engaging accordingly. The diaspora engagement has intensified under the present government, that is the NDA 2 and 3 government, because we have to understand that Indian diaspora right now in major countries such as UAE, US, even in Canada, are highly mobilized and highly supportive of the government of the day in India. So that is also a very important aspect. And finally, we cannot undermine the role of US that India has. And finally, we have to understand that all of the countries in the world are having mutual interest in these things, which India also places a high emphasis on, especially after the G20 meet. India has said that it will be trying to promote a sustainable economic order or international order. It will be balancing China's behavior, cooperating on issues like climate change, collaborating on global health, digital technologies, artificial intelligence, alleviating burdens on developing countries. These are all the areas where India is taking the lead as the global South leader, specifically also in the Voice of Global South Summit in New Delhi, in which the Prime Minister of India expressed that the global South cannot no longer be suppressed, right? So it can also be the thing that countries like Malaysia, Turkey, Afghanistan, Iran, Bangladesh, Nepal, so they can be kind of brought under the ambit of India in the subsequent years. In the next article, we have to understand it is talking about the Women's Bill, but this is a thing which has been discussed in the previous sessions. Here we will be talking about a various important aspect of GS2, Parliament and state legislatures. The context is that the Nari Shakti Vandan Adhiniyam Bill 2023 has been passed by both houses of the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Now this bill is awaiting the assent of the President. But the thing is that the Home Minister of India has said that this bill or this act cannot be truly or say transparently implemented till the delimitation exercise is concluded. The delimitation exercise is supposed to be held in 2026. So until that, the women reservation bill cannot be truly implemented in letter and spirit. So we must understand what is delimitation all about. See, we have to understand in a democracy, the vote is very equal, right? We have to understand this equality of vote is also very important for the people of India, because according to Article 14 of our Indian Constitution, we say there must be equality to all. Now, the idea of delimitation is that everyone must be having equal votes. And extending this idea to the geographical extent of India, according to Election Commission, delimitation is defined by the act or process of fixing limits, boundaries or territorial constituencies in a country or a province having a legislative body. So, we have the parliament, we have various seats in the parliament. To determine how many seats there shall be in a parliament or there shall be in a state legislature, we need to calculate the number of people that there are in a particular constituency, right? Which is the basic fundamental block of democracy. So from constituency we get voters, from voters we get votes, and each of the constituencies are represented by our own representatives. In the states, they are the member of legislative assemblies. At the central level, they are the member of parliaments. So to elect them, we need some constituencies from where they will be coming from. So the number of the constituencies, the first one. Second, the boundaries of those constituencies will be decided by delimitation exercise in India, and this has a constitutional ground that we'll be going to study. Now we have to say the idea is having an equal ratio, the number of constituencies in that particular state and the population of the state must be equal, and then only it will be serving this idea of vote of every person must be having similar weight. Now this is also the similar practice which is carried at the state assembly and the parliament, right? And the constitution needs to be amended if this delimitation exercise is done. And that is why the 42nd amendment, the 84th amendment and subsequently some 2 more amendments were done. So in total, 4 total amendments were done with reference to delimitation in India. Now why it is needed? Obviously, it is to change the, aspirations of the people. It is to reflect the aspirations of the people, because population in a particular country, in a particular state, city, district increases over a period of time, and due to this demographic change we have to redraw, we have to change the constituencies maps or say numbers if it is needed, right? So it is to reflect the population should remain equal. Then there should be a fair geographical division also. For example, say we have seen various maps of certain constituencies, such maps can be in this manner, right? Such irregular figures where actually the constituency should be say in a shape of a polygon or say so a square or say a rectangle or say a regular shape, right? This is an act of drawing constituency in such an haphazard and irregular manner is actually known by the term of gerrymandering. It can be the thing that while you are designing such an irregular map, you are trying to include those households which are actually voting in your favor, right? So delimitation is trying to restrict that. Delimitation is saying that the population representation must be the same across the entire states of India with reference to their number of constituencies in that particular state. So this will be preventing gerrymandering, which is kind of also prevalent in the United States. And also finally we have to understand that we have to give a level playing field to all the political parties, to all the candidates, to all the voters who are voting. So in India, we have various articles. The Article 82 of Indian Constitution is saying that the President will be enacting a delimitation act and constitute delimitation commission every census. Article 170 is telling that the division of the constituencies of the states will be done by the delimitation commission after every census. Article 330 and 332, as of today, as of the time of recording, it is saying that the refixing of seats reserved for SCs and STs in Lok Sabha and state legislative assemblies shall have to be according to 2001 census. And accordingly, Parliament enacted the Act of Delimitation Act, where the orders are final. It means that if Delimitation Commission is setting up delimitation of any constituencies, that is to be final. Nothing can be questioned in any court of law. Why? Because if someone tries to object the decision of the Delimitation Commission, it can lead to delays in elections. That is why it cannot be questioned into any court of law, and it is final authority. It is one of the very few things which is outside the purview of Indian judiciary. And also we have to understand the Delimitation Commission, its appointments and members. We have to see the appointment is done by the President of India with consultation with the Election Commission of India. In the Delimitation Commission, the members are retired Supreme Court judge, which must be there, who is the chairperson. Now that person will be accompanied by the Chief Election Commissioner of that time and the respective state election commissioners. Now, so far the census has been conducted around 7 times and delimitation has been done around 4 times. Right? The 2002 was the last delimitation, which was about redrawing the boundaries of the states, not changing the number of seats. It was only about the redrawing of the boundaries of the state. No increase in the number of constituencies were found, which were freezed at the level of 1976 population. Now we have to understand that why delimitation has been fixed at 1976 population and why at all it is a very hot political debate, or it can also be said political hot potato, because we have to understand this is concerning the number of seats. And if we can see from the very beginning, from the very start, 1951 census, the initial seats in the Lok Sabha were around 489 to 494 to 552, right? And finally to 443. So these were the number of seats which were changed in subsequent Delimitation Commission. And every time the number of seats increase, there is always a grapple for the seats. So this is a political battlefield. And also in the 1970s, there was a growing concern that indirectly the Constitution of India said that the number of seats or number of constituencies in Lok Sabha will be kind of dependent on the population of a state. So if the population of a state is very high, it will be resulting in high number of seats for states like UP, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, which has a larger population from the South Indian states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, which have smaller population. Why? Because these states undertook some of the reforms in family control, or say limiting the increase of population. So the South Indian states, particularly represented by the regional parties of DMK, TDP and others, they alleged that the North Indian states are having more say in the Lok Sabha because they are having more population, hence more seats for these states. So that will be a violation of equality, right? Because the South Indian states, even as a collective, they cannot match the strengths of the North Indian states. So that is why in 1976, through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act, Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of the day, kind of suspended the redrawing of boundaries and seat allocation till 2001. So it was freezed at 1976 level, particularly due to this debate. This will be to promote more and more family planning in the northern states, so that the southern states and the northern states kind of converge with respect to the population, and finally with respect to the weightage in the legislative assembly at the center. Then we have to understand there also this also was to address political concerns. The same thing was also done in 2001. Where the seats were freezed up to the level of 2026, right, at 1976 level, because the National Population Policy Strategy kind of expected that equal number of births and deaths will be in all of the states kind of at 2026 levels. And also we can see that TFR in India is kind of declining below 2 at the all India level, but some states like UP and Bihar still have higher population, or say higher TFR than 2. Now also this is also talking about the representation of seats for SC, ST and women, right? So obviously the voter banks are also at play due to this SC/ST and women. Now, the way ahead in this matter is a very interesting one, that the delay in delimitation will be ultimately delaying the reservation for women. But what to do here? Because the next exercise will be of delimitation is actually scheduled for 2026, and even until now the 2021 census has not been done due to COVID crisis. And now even if we start now, right, at 2023 if we start the house listing, which is the very first phase of census, it will be taking up to around 2025 for enumeration, plus 2 years for more studies and research to formally publish the census. So we have to understand the next delimitation in 2026 that will be happening will be taking the place of a delayed 2021 census. So it is expected that in 2029 in general elections, this bill or say this act of reservation of women will be finally in place, right? So this is the idea. Now the next article is about the climate ambition summit, which is taking place in New York of United States. Here the context is that this is taking place in the state, and there are the absence of China, US and India, which are the top global polluters of carbon dioxide emissions. Now let us understand what is the climate action summit all about. See, in 2015 the entire world converged on the Paris Agreement, which tried to limit the rise of global temperature by 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050 and 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. And this was supported by various schemes and policies that the world would follow with respect to their climate goals. And if the world, if you understand, should be on a track of reaching their climate goals, they need funds for investment in renewable energy, in phasing out fossil fuels. And these funds are very important for some developing countries such as India and China, right? Because we have to understand that in Paris Agreement, the entire world agreed that they will be doing a global stocktake, or the amount of initiative that the entire world has done for reducing fossil fuels in 2023, that is due in the upcoming COP. Then the global stocktake will also take after 5 years in 2028. So on this matter only, the United Nations Secretary Antonio Guterres has called a climate action summit at the UN headquarters in New York City. He has said that the climate action summits will be showcasing leaders of the day who are movers and doers, and they can have credible actions, policies and plans to keep this goal active. And here the summit will be presenting the collective goal of the entire world, that the entire world is ready for taking climate change actions. To accelerate and pace the scale, that means to realize the amount of will that the countries have and to actually invest in these climate action initiatives for a just transition. Just transition means that the transition must be taking place where the carbon dioxide levels are less, right? And this can be possible if we make a transition to a green economy where the economy is running on non-fossil fuel energy. And this will be sharing basing an equitable renewable energy and finally a climate resilient global economy. So this is trying to represent that India and the entire world, or say the entire global leaders, will be converging in this manner. Now this summit will be having 3 tracks. 3 tracks means the 3 tracks of negotiation. First, the ambition track will be consisting the governments. The credibility tracks will be consisting of leaders of business, cities, regions and financial institutions such as banks, central banks. And finally, they will be also talking on the implementation track on how ambition and credibility agents are trying to implement the Paris climate goals. Now, we have to understand the criteria for the countries to actually be considered for a speaking slot will be based on this particular criteria. The first criteria is if they had presented their updated pre-2030 NDCs on nationally determined contributions which they agreed in Paris Climate Agreement, right? Then the updated net zero targets will also have to be announced by them. Their energy transition plans with reference to their no coal, no new coal, oil or gas projects. Then fossil fuel phase out plans must be there. More ambitious renewable targets must be there after the Paris Climate Agreement. Green Climate Fund must be there, and economy-wide plans on adaptation and mitigation on climate resilience must be there. Then only the countries will be given the opportunity to speak. India last updated its goals in 2022, where the Prime Minister of India announced Panchamrit. Panchamrit, you can see, are all these goals which are India's NDCs as of now. India is trying to achieve these goals to become a green economy and finally a net zero emitter of carbon dioxide or say emissions by 2070. But there are various experts say that India's commitment of 2022 is not on track with reference to the Paris Climate Agreement. And also some of the other G20 countries are also in tow with India in this situation. But we have to understand that India's low per capita emissions must also have to be factored, because China and US are far more consuming more emissions historically rather than India. So this was the thing that we need to know about our Climate Action Summit. The next article is about household savings in India, because according to a recent report, and say this was in the RBI bulletin of recent month, the net household savings declined to a 47-year low of 5.1% of GDP in 2023 financial year. Now we have to understand the household savings declined. Now let us understand the very basics. See, the income is based on consumption plus saving, right? That means saving is what? Your income minus consumption. Now we know that higher savings are better for an economy, because these savings which we place in our banks will be used in investments, because banks will be giving out loans to businesses who will be investing, and hence we must be understand that the more the savings are, the better are the investment. But here we have to understand that the net domestic or say household savings declined not categorically. They declined due to some minor differences that we need to look at. Now here, according to Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation in India, the household sector is consisting of individuals, all non-government and non-corporate enterprises. So these are the household sector, which are just people like you and me who are at their houses, right, sitting and not generating any employment opportunity within the house. They're just normal, ordinary individuals. Now these are, they are having some kind of savings, right? Now these savings can be investments in the instruments of financial saving, that can be in terms of currency, net deposits, shares, debentures, that are including mutual funds, net claim on the government in case of say small saving instruments, investment in central and state government securities, life insurance and provident and pension funds. So these are all the savings, financial savings of Indian households. Apart from them, Indians also have say physical savings or say assets like a particular household plot, then it can be gold, which are physical in nature. Now this financial, we have to understand the decline in savings. We have to understand this took place with reference to the savings account. That the people are having money in their savings account. This is the trajectory that we can see is declining over a period of time. But with reference to their term deposit and current account, they are not declining. Because especially with reference to term deposit, people are investing more money because they are getting some interest rate. And accordingly, if we can say the classification of assets in India, the highest asset is property that people have. That is a physical asset. The next is also a physical asset, gold. Then comes bank deposit, insured bonds, right? Insurance funds and subsequently. So for your examination, for your prelims examination, you can keep the track of this figure. And also, we have to understand that the household savings with reference to their savings account is decreasing. Why? Because now the people are becoming more clever, right? They are no longer say dependent on say gold or property. They are now investing in mutual funds. They are now investing in stocks. They are now investing in currencies, foreign currencies. They are investing in financial aspects or assets. This is actually reflected from the market indices that we can see, that the BSE Sensex, the BSE Mid Cap, which are mid-sized companies, the BSE Small Caps, which are the indicators for small companies which have a high potential in the near future, they are actually having a steep growth. Why? Because people are using their savings accounts, the money that are having in the savings account, in these instruments, in these companies. So they are buying more and more financial assets. They are becoming financially literate. This is a good thing. This is a good thing because the mutual funds, the companies, they can use people's extra savings to have more investments, and hence the economy can grow more. This can also be seen from the monthly SIP or systematic investment plans that are also a form of mutual funds. So we can see from 2019, it has been a kind of an increase, particularly from 2020, there has been a consistent increase in the SIPs that the people are doing on a monthly basis. That means people are becoming more and more financially prudent, that they can be getting more and more percentage than their savings account. Also, if you can see from the financial year of 2018 to 2022, how the at 2019 levels, how right now the people are investing more and more in mutual fund, bank deposits, life insurance funds in this manner. And we can see from 2019, this has been always more than 2019 levels, because people are now trying to invest more and more in security, say financial aspects. So this was all for today. I thank you for all attending the session. All the best for your endeavors. We'll meet again soon.